Hello and welcome back to A Squirrel Plays. It's me, the Squirrel, and today we're going to talk about a D&D mod of mine I've been using in our current campaign, and that mod is Magic Dice. Or if you prefer, you can call it ARMD, which stands for Altered Rests and Magic Dice. The Altered Rests is actually completely optional, or well, technically all of this is optional because we're talking about custom rules for a tabletop game. But the part I want to focus on first is the Magic Dice. The reason I'm also including Altered Rests is for two reasons. One, I hate long rests. I think they're extremely silly. Setting up camp in the middle of a dungeon for 8 hours is just nonsense. Throw in the tiny hut spell and you just have all kinds of stupid. And if you didn't watch the video before this one, let me reiterate something. Every table is different. What works at mine may have no place at yours, but whatever you do, make sure everybody is on board first. And second, if you're going to use Magic Dice, then you'll most likely need to do something about your long rests, and you will see why as we get into this. So what are Magic Dice? What in the world am I talking about? In short, Magic Dice are something every player has, and they can use the Magic Dice to replenish spell slots and abilities instead of just copping a squat in the middle of a dungeon. This allows the players to keep moving forward with an extra supply of resources they can allocate where need be. As for how it actually works, let me explain. A magic die is a D20. Doesn't matter what race, class, feats, or anything else, it is always a D20. Your quantity of magic dice is equal to your level. So at level 1, you only have 1. At level 2, you have 2 magic dice. And at level 10, you have 10 magic dice, so forth and so on. If you want to restore a spell slot, you will need a number of magic dice equal to the level of the spell slot. That means if you want to restore a level 2 spell slot, you will need to use 2 magic dice. I'll explain how the rolling works in a second. If you wanted to restore a level 1 spell slot, you would only need 1 magic die. And if you wanted to restore a level 5 spell slot, then you would need 5 magic dice. For abilities, it's a little bit different. As a general rule, I've been giving it a 2-to-1 ratio, meaning it takes 2 magic dice to restore 1 ability use. Now, you will need to balance this to fit your table. For example, lay on hands, you may want to do 1 to 5, meaning 1 magic dice will restore 5 uses of lay on hands. There may be some other abilities, or even your own custom abilities you've made, that you feel need to require 3 magic dice to recharge a single use. I'm not making a complete table of ratios because I feel that's where 5e messes everything up. They have a rule for just about everything, which causes people to spend more time looking things up instead of playing the game and using their imagination. So get with your group and decide how many are needed for each of their abilities, then everybody is happy, hopefully. And that brings us to rolling the actual dice. Now how does that work? As mentioned before, all the dice are a D20 regardless of who or what you are. If you want to restore a level 1 spell slot, as I mentioned before, it will require 1 magic die. To restore that spell slot, you will take 1 magic die and then roll it. If you roll a 1, that die is gone and you do not get your spell back. Basically, you broke the magic die. If you roll anything between 2 and 19, you get the spell back. However, the die has now been used and is no longer available. If you roll a 20, you get the spell back and you get to keep the die, meaning you could roll again if you wanted to for another spell slot. Now, if you were trying to restore a level 2 spell slot, then you would need to roll 2 magic dice. If one of them landed on a 1 and the other a 6, then you would need to roll another magic dice because the die that rolled 1 broke. If you didn't have any other magic dice available, then you would have to choose a level 1 spell slot to restore instead. On the other hand, if you were rolling 2 magic dice for your level 2 spell slot and one of them landed on a 20, then you would get to restore that level 2 spell slot with only a single dice because you get to keep the one that landed on 20. This means you have a 5% chance of loss, a 5% chance of getting a freebie, and a 90% chance to get your spell back as planned. Now, if a player rolls 2 dice for an ability and gets a nat 1 but has nothing else they can devote their single magic die to that didn't break, then it's up to you how you want to handle that. You can say both dice are lost if they can't use the single roll, or you can allow them to hang on to the one they couldn't use. Personally, if they didn't have anything the leftover die could go to, I'd just let them keep it. You also might be wondering at this point, how does one restore their magic dice? You do that by taking a long rest. At my table, long rests restore 100% of your magic and hit dice, but there's a couple reasons for that. One reason is I made long rests a lot harder to come by, and two, everybody is playing a custom race one of our players made. They're all mushroom people, and they have some nice regenerative abilities, which has slightly changed how hit dice are used. I'll probably do a video on that race at some point, as the people I've shown it to have really liked the concept, and so far the campaign has been a hit. But anyway, this is where altered rests comes into play. Since magic dice can restore your abilities, and magic dice are restored simply by resting, you now need to tone down the long rests, and odds are your players aren't going to be too keen on that idea. If they're like the average player, they'll love the idea of magic dice because that gives them more power, but soon as you start taking away something, they'll get defensive. Ideally, what I prefer to do is to break up the adventures into small chapters. The end of the chapter usually means the party has returned to their base of operations to recover, meaning they're back to 100%. For the entire chapter, however, there is no resting. But that's just my ideal situation and not always how it plays out. So what I recommend doing is for each session have a long rest plan. And by that, I mean write down a couple versions of long rests getting interrupted and how many resources you want to give back to your players. Again, I would like to reiterate that some things you can't just make a flat rule for. If I said an interrupted long rest only restores 1/4 of your magic dice, then that's going to really suck for the first handful of levels. So instead of creating an end-all be-all formula, just plan for your group's current progress. If the party is at level 4, then consider interrupting their long rest if they attempt one and giving them 2 magic dice as well as some hit points. If you're the GM, it's up to you how much you want to make them sweat. To give you an example, my group was considering a long rest in the middle of a dungeon, as players tend to do. At the time, they were only level 2, some were more beat up than the others, and some had expended a lot of spells and abilities already. To be fair, they had killed a lot of goblins by this point. What I had planned for their long rest, had they chosen to do so, was that a couple goblins would interrupt them. Not only would they have to fight the goblins and burn more resources that way, but all they would have gotten from the rest would have been 1 magic die, 1 hit die, 1 spore, which is a resource for their custom race, and if anybody was below 50% HP, then I would have let them refill up to the 50% mark, rounded down. For a level 10 player, that's not much at all, but for a level 2 player, that's pretty good. Your altered rests will need to be tuned to your party's level, and because of that, I highly recommend you make yourself a note each time they level up to plan out various gains from interrupted rests. And if you want to go the extra mile, nothing says each player has to regain the same amount either. One player could get 100% health and nothing else. One player could get all their magic dice back and nothing else. One could restore a couple spells on their own and a little health, but no extra dice. And whatever else you wish to come up with. You're the GM, it's your world, the rest of us are just living in it. And if you're wondering why my group didn't take the rest, that's because they had 1 room left to check out before committing to the idea. And that room was sort of a mini-boss with a chest to loot. Had they taken the rest, the chest only would have contained some gold. However, since they kept pushing forward, I rewarded them with a couple potions in the chest since there was a boss coming up, plus the gold, and even a few magic dice to pass around. This was slightly better than the interrupted rest, plus they didn't have to fight the goblins that woke them up. But even better, the game kept moving forward because there was no stopping. You might say it was a bit more immersive. And that's it. That's magic dice. I don't think it's anything too terribly complicated, but it does shake things up a good bit. I think it's a great way to keep your party moving forward, whether or not you hate long rests. If you're familiar with hero dice, then magic dice might sound kind of familiar, but I hadn't heard of those until just a few days ago when Professor Dungeon Master over at Dungeon Craft dropped his video Top 5 Rules Nobody Uses, but really should. He also talked about a mod called Lucky Dice, which I really want to use, but I will need to modify slightly. Because we have one player that just has the absolute worst luck when it comes to rolling, and I feel so bad for him. Poor guy misses about 90% of his attacks, I swear. It's unreal. But anyway, that's that. Let me know what you think about magic dice and how they would never work at your table and how much of it you would need to change or just completely throw out.